Yes, Bess?
Is it possible their electricity is out?
I haven't heard of outages, but it could be, but
I think it stopped.
no,
No, it's
no,
hard to
I
tell
hear
on
it
the screen.
sleeting against my window.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, no, I'm looking right outside and it's still snowing and sleeting. Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad everybody gets to watch that on the recording now too. Uh, and let me share my screen. Here we go. Okay, and just okay. So we had left off um, here after the Mishnah and beginning of the Gemara on page 163 in the Koran PDF. The Gemara further asks. But that was 2 weeks ago, and if you don't mind, I think we can quickly go back to the Mishnah um, and um, and and catch up. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So this is the start of chapter 2 of Bava Batra with regard to the presumptive ownership of houses and of pits and of ditches and of caves which are used to collect water and of dovecotes and of bathhouses and of olive presses and of irrigated fields which must be watered by people and of slaves and all similar property that constantly, that is throughout the year, generates profits. Their presumptive ownership is established by working and profiting from them for a duration of 3 years from day to day. So I just want to see the note here for just a second, the presumptive ownership. Uh, okay, so it said the Ritva is a medieval rabbi who his name is his abbreviation of his full name. Writes that presumptive ownership, or chazaka in Hebrew, discussed here, differs from the same term when employed with regard to acquisition. Here, the fact that he has been living on the land for a certain amount of time is viewed as proof that is indeed his, but it's not in and of itself a mode of acquiring the land. The same term, when employed with regard to acquisition, is used to describe one who actually acquires land by treating it as only an owner would, even for a minimal amount of time. The simplest way to establish that one has title to immovable property, so real estate, is by presenting, or like the cave, the irrigated field, etc., in our Mishnah, is by presenting a bill of sale signed by witnesses, or to have witnesses testify that he has purchased it. In the absence of either one of these, one can establish the presumption of ownership by acting with regard to the property as an owner would for the length of time specified in the Mishnah, in accordance with the various opinions stated there. So the first third of this chapter focuses on instances where there is a dispute as to who owns property, the one currently in possession of it, or another individual who claims to be the owner. Okay, so that's presumptive ownership. So how this situation arises, I don't know. Why would it be a case where somebody's ditch, somebody's bathhouse, dovecote, etc., that people don't have title to it and they just become presumptive owners? It's possible the Gemara will talk about that, but we have to leave it as is, especially slaves too. How can one be a presumptive owner of a slave when it's clear you're talking about a human being who the human being should have a sense of who owns the human being, but perhaps the slave has no right to say who owns him or her. So perhaps the Gemara will get into things like this. Um, uh, if the one in possession of the property can prove that he worked and profited from it for the previous 3 full years, there is a presumption that it belongs to him. and would remain in his possession if another were to claim that the property belonged to him or to his ancestors. Okay, so all these things in the Mishnah so far, three, if you can prove you've been using it for 3 years in a row, it's yours. With regard to a non-irrigated field, that is one that is watered by rain, in which produce grows during certain seasons during the year, its presumption of ownership is established in 3 years, but they are not from day to day, since the fields are not worked and harvested continually throughout the 3-year period. Rabbi Ishmael says 3 months of possession in the first year, 3 months of possession in the last year, and 12 months of possession in the middle, which are 18 months, suffice to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to a non-irrigated field. Rabbi Akiva says, well, so the anonymous is saying 3 years for non-irrigated, even though you're not working it for part of the time. So you might not be on the field, but you're working it during the rainy season. So that counts, so that's still part of the 3 years. Whereas Ishmael says, all you need is 3 months in 1 year, 12 months of another year, and 3 months of another year, so 18 months is enough. And Akiva says a month of possession in the first year, a month of possession in the last year, 12 months of possession in the middle, which are 14 months, suffice to establish a presumption of ownership with regard to non-irrigated field. And Ishmael said, so Ishmael says 18 months, Akiva says 14 months. Ishmael said, in what case is this statement that 18 months are required for a non-irrigated field said? It is said with regard to a white field, that is a grain field. But with regard to a field of trees, once he gathered his produce, and then harvested his olives, and then gathered his figs, these 3 harvests are the equivalent of 3 years. Since he harvested 3 types of produce, this is equivalent to having possessed the field for 3 years. Okay, so Ishmael and Akiva, Ishmael's clarifying how you can gain ownership of these kinds of fields. Okay, so the Gemara here. So Rabbi Yochanan said, I heard from those who traveled to Usha, and Usha is a city in the north of Israel that was the home to the Sanhedrin after the Bar Kokhba revolt. So it was Jerusalem first until the temple was destroyed, and then it was Yavne, which was granted permission by the general Titus to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to set up an academy there. And so that Yavne is kind of south of Tel Aviv today. And then after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Rabbinical Academy moved north. So where it stayed, it was in Usha, and then I think Tzipori, and then Tiberias. Okay, all cities in the north. So I heard from those who traveled to Usha to study with the sages there that they would say, from where is it derived that presumptive ownership is established in 3 years? Okay, so we're starting from the beginning of the Mishnah about presumptive ownership being 3 years. What's the basis for 3 years? Why isn't it 5 years? Why isn't it 2 years? What's the idea with 3? From the forewarned ox. So that's the basis. From that law of the forewarned ox, we can learn this law of presumptive ownership. So just as in the case of a forewarned ox, once it has intentionally gored 3 gorings, it left the presumptive status of an innocuous ox, and it is established as having the presumptive status of a forewarned ox. Here too, so that's a whole discussion in Baba Kama about the ox, because the Torah talks about an ox that gores, so using its horns to injure or kill someone. So people in Israel, the Torah assumes people know that oxen are dangerous animals. Even if they are owned by a person and kind of domesticated in that way, they're still wild animals and they could act out. So some um, some oxen are in the category, the status of Tom, which is innocuous, like it hasn't gored already. So if an innocuous ox gores, then it's an accident. And the owner of the ox pays less for damages to someone injured by an innocuous ox because that he had no right, he didn't think his ox was going to gore anybody, and people were taking that ox for granted and might have gotten closer than usual because they knew that that ox was innocuous. But when an ox becomes mu'ad, that is, once it has gored and has gored three times, then it is in the category of forewarned, meaning the owner of that ox has to have take special care of it and warn other people around it that wherever he goes with it, that this ox is dangerous and they could be injured if they get close. And if he doesn't, if the owner doesn't forewarn people, then he faces he faces extreme penalty and damages. Like if the forewarned ox murders somebody and he hadn't warned people about that ox being dangerous, then the owner of the ox is considered a murderer. Even though he himself didn't do the murdering, the ox did. The fact that he didn't warn would make him a murderer. So that's what this is. So because a, a forewarned ox needs to gore three times to become the category of forewarned, that because three is used for that, Rabbi Yochanan is saying three is used for 3 years to have presumptive ownership of a field or any one of those things in the Mishnah. Okay, so just as in the case of a forewarned ox, once it has intentionally gored three gorings, it left the presumptive status of an innocuous ox, and it is established as having the presumptive status of a forewarned ox. Here too, once he has worked and profited from the land for 3 years, the land left the possession of the seller, and it's established as being in the possession of the buyer.
Jonah,
Yes, Bess.
an ox is a male bull that's been castrated?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's the Hebrew word is shor, and I don't know the difference between an ox and a bull.
I'm
But
pretty
if that's the case, um,
because
then
they wouldn't yoke bulls who are not castrated.
got it. Okay, okay,
So
that makes sense.
what is there not there's another word for bull, I presume in Hebrew.
No, sure.
Ah, so this could go for a bull or an ox.
Well, it's translated here as ox, and it's usually translated in the Torah as ox.
Because a bull is more violent than an ox.
Well, but also some sacrifices are bulls and some sacrifices are oxen. But it's the same word, sure. So it's an interesting point, and so can you Google what's is that for sure the difference between an ox and a bull? Is that ox is castrated?
Hold on. You want is
Yeah, look it
done?
up, please.
Okay. This is AI.
Yes.
They're both bovines cattle. They differ primarily in their reproductive status, temperament, and purpose. An ox is a castrated bull or sometimes a steer. I have no idea what the difference between bull and steer is.
Ah,
Um, Trained to perform labor, whereas a bull is an intact male. I like that. Intact. Used primarily for breeding.
got it.
And
All
they have
right, so the ox is used for plowing. Usually that's
The draft animal,
right.
right?
And the bull, you keep the bull. Like you have most farms would have one bull to take care of breeding the cows.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't think you'd have more than one bull because the
Oh,
bulls would fight each other over
right.
the cows.
And ox are often larger than bulls because they're usually at a young age and they work for many years.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes a difference
There
here.
you go. So I think I'm
Sorry.
not sure one can sacrifice an ox. I think you can only sacrifice a bull. I think that's the case because just as the Kohanim have to be pure and intact physically, the animals have to be without blemish and intact when they're offered. So, okay. So, but your question then about the ox versus the bull here, what was it? You're muted again.
Well, thank you. Why aren't they distinguishing or
Uh, be,
eliminating the bull? That's what I'm wondering. It's
why
only
aren't they distinguishing what?
why doesn't the Mishnah or the Gemara distinguish between a bull and an ox? Say, I mean,
Uh,
bulls also the same
uh,
categories as innocuous or forewarned or
right. So that's an interesting question, and now I have to try to find it in it's in the portion Mishpatim where we see it for the first time. So if you give me a moment to find it in the Chumash, then I
so.
can.
Did we do that the Daf Yomi already? I don't remember.
Yes,
Years
yes,
ago, right?
right, years ago. But let me just find it. Okay. Here we go. The homicidal beast. Okay. All right. So if you happen to have a Chumash handy, 463 in the Eitz Chaim, chapter 21 of Exodus, verse 28. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox is not to be punished. If, however, that ox has been in the habit of goring, that is, a forewarned, and its owner, though warned, has failed to guard it. In other words, the court has told the owner, your ox is now in the category of a goring ox. You need to take care of it appropriately and warn other people about it. And that person fails to do that, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner too shall be put to death. Okay, so that's the basis for these laws in the portion Mishpatim. Um, so the word there is sure. Now, if we go to Vayikra to look at animals that are offered as sacrifice,
Then it raises another question. Maybe the Gemara will deal with it.
yeah,
This they're talking about the owner is liable or not liable,
yeah.
but the owner might not have any contact with the ox. It's
When
the tenant farmer, or
oh no 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 no
you rent an ox.
no no, I think you're no. So they're not conflating the two and applying the two laws to each other and no. The basis for presumptive ownership of field or dovecote or anything like that of being 3 years, like why three, not two, four, five, is based on three warnings of an ox. Just because there's a number three there for the ox, so we'll use the number three for a presumptive ownership.
No, I'm saying, what if the person who handles the ox doesn't own it? He rented it or leased it, or it's
Oh,
not his.
okay. So that we'd have to, that's a, I don't know, Bess, and that's beyond our,
Okay,
yeah. So
okay.
I'm not going to get into that, but I will get into figuring out whether you can offer an ox um, as a sacrifice. Um, So I'm just looking. Ah, so it's interesting. I think the Torah does distinguish. The word shor is for ox, and then in Leviticus, a bull is just ben habakar, like a male of the herd. So, yeah, but um, I'm not sure if that's the case. Just one second. I have a feeling some of the sacrifices on the holidays. Uh, no, just a second. No, it's usually Ben Habakar from the cases I've seen so far in the Torah. So yeah, I assumed that shore meant bull, but it's technically should be translated as ox. Okay, so let's let's say do this again. Just as in a case of a forewarned ox, once it has intentionally gored three gorings, it left the presumptive status of an innocuous ox and it established as having the presumptive status of a forewarned ox. Here too, once he has worked and profited from the land for 3 years, the land left the possession of the seller and established as being in the possession of the buyer. 3 times to gore to become forewarned, 3 years then. So 3 and 3. The Gemara questions this comparison. So is it legitimate, the Gemara is asking, to use the forewarning of the ox, the warning of the ox 3 times to be the basis for presumptive ownership? If so, say that just as with a forewarned ox, the owner is not liable to pay full damages until the 4th goring, here too the land should not be established as being in his possession until the 4th year. Right? The Mishnah says 3 years. So that means, but does it mean during the 3rd year or does it mean in the 4th year? So the Mishnah should have been more precise in its language to say in the 4th year, then he becomes the presumptive owner. The Gemara rejects this question. How can these cases be compared? There, once it has gored 3 times, it is forewarned, and the requirement for there to be another 4th incident for the owner to be liable to pay full damages exists because before it gores, after having become a forewarned ox, what is there for the owner to pay? Here, once he has worked and profited from the land for 3 years, the land is established as being in his possession, right? So it's the forewarning is based on the act of the goring, whereas the presumptive ownership is based on a long time of working the land. So it's not a one-shot thing. You have a whole year of working the land versus a one-shot gore. So maybe it's not appropriate to compare cases. The Gemara asks, if that is so, according to the explanation that the forewarned ox is the source for the presumption of ownership with regard to land, even possession that is not accompanied by a claim, that is, where the possessor has no explanation as to how he acquired it, should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, just as goring 3 times automatically establishes its having the status of a forewarned ox. Why did we learn in a Mishnah, up ahead on page 41, any possession that is not accompanied by a claim explaining how the possessor became the owner is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? The Gemara answers, what's the reason that possession that is not accompanied by a claim is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? Because in a standard case where one has presumptive ownership, we say that even if the claimant proves that the field was once his, since the other is in possession of the land, perhaps the truth is as he says, that he purchased it from the previous owner. But now that he himself does not claim that he purchased it, will we claim this for him? So in other words, it matters who's doing the claiming of ownership. Rav Avira objects to the explanation that the presumption with regard to land is derived from the halacha of a forewarned ox. If that is so, a protest that the claimant lodges during the 3 years not in the presence of the possessor should not be considered a protest, because it must be similar to the halacha of a forewarned ox. Just as we require that the testimony concerning a forewarned ox be in its owner's presence, so too here we should also require that a protest be lodged in the possessor's presence, right? So they are trying to apply some of the technical elements of the litigation of the forewarned ox to the claim of the possession of the land. So the claim of an ox to be forewarned has to be done in the presence of witnesses and in a court. So too, the claim for presumptive ownership of land has to be in the presence in the presence of the possessor. Yeah. So the claim, if someone who has a claim against someone who has been presumptive owner of a land, that claim has to be in each other's presence. The Gemara answers, this is not difficult. There, with regard to a forewarned ox, it's written, and warning has been given to its owner, indicating that the warning must be issued in the presence of the owner. Here, with regard to the protest, your friend has a friend, and the friend of your friend has a friend, so that the protest will become known even if lodged not in the presence of the possessor, as word of it will spread. There's no Torah edict mandating that the protest be lodged in his presence, and it's sufficient that he hears of it even secondhand. So with regard to land, we can rely on word spreading. With regard to the ox, we can't rely on that. The Gemara further asks, and this is where we had left off last time. The Gemara further asks, and according to Rabbi Meir, who says when the ox performs its gorings at intervals, its owner is liable. If it performs its goring successively, is it not all the more so the case that its owner is liable? According to his opinion, the animal must gore only 3 times to become forewarned, and it's not required that the gorings occur on 3 separate days. They can all occur on the same day. Similarly, one could say that if he profited from the field by consuming 3 fruits of, for example, a fig tree within 1 day, that should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, right? So that would be another difference between the 3 gorings could happen on the same day. They don't have to be 3 separate days. And so therefore, Rabbi Meir says, well, we can't apply that logic to picking a fig off a tree. If you pick 3 figs, well, is that enough? That's all part of the same harvest. So it doesn't make sense. The Gemara answers this would not be a valid comparison, as presumptive ownership with regard to land must be similar to the halacha of a forewarned ox. Just as with a forewarned ox, at the time when the animal has this goring, it does not have that goring, as each act of goring occurs at a separate time. Here, too, in order for the consumption of the produce to establish the presumption of ownership, it must be that at the time when this fruit is here, that fruit is not here. When all the produce of the field is extant concurrently, consumption of this produce does not establish the presumption of ownership, even if the produce is consumed at 3 different times, right? So each harvest is considered a time, and each goring is considered a goring. The Gemara asks, based on this, if he profited from the field by consuming three fruits within 3 consecutive days, for example, the fruits of a caper bush, whose fruits ripen day after day, that should be sufficient to establish a presumption of ownership, as all three fruits were not ripe concurrently. Right? So, yeah, so that you can say the same capers in Israel, blueberries here, or raspberries here. They ripen at different times, right? You can go back to the same bush for a few days and still have ripe berries on the bush. Same with capers. Maybe that's each time a different harvesting, even though it's the same bush. The Gemara answers there with regard to the caper bush, at least the fruit is here and it's in the process of finishing its ripening during the 3 days. This is not similar to the goring ox, where each goring is fully independent of the others. Right? So a bush is a bush, and all the berries are there, the capers are there, so it doesn't count as three separate harvests. Whereas the goring, it's three separate people that are being gored by the ox. Okay, the Gemara challenges. Based on this, if he profited from the field by consuming three fruits within 30 days, for example, alfalfa, which quickly regrows when cut, and which is repeatedly cut over a short period of time, that should be sufficient to establish a presumption of ownership. Okay, so what if you're harvesting a quick growing crop so that it could quickly regrow within a harvesting season? So would that count as presumptive ownership then? Like cutting alfalfa, it grows back, cutting it, it grows back, cutting it, and it's all done within the space of a month. Is that enough for as separate harvests? The Gemara explains, what are the circumstances where it could regrow 3 times within 30 days? Where it grows a little and he cuts and consumes it, where it grows a little more and he consumes it, such that he cuts it 3 times within 30 days. There, he's seizing and consuming the alfalfa, which is not the normal way of farming it, and consequently he does not establish the presumption of ownership, which is established only through standard use of the land. Okay, so if you do it this way to try to gain presumptive ownership quicker, you can't do it that way. You have to do it only in the standard way of harvesting whatever crop is on the land. The Gemara challenges. Based on this, if he profited from the field by consuming three fruits within 3 months, for example, alfalfa, where he did employ the standard method of harvesting it, that should be sufficient to establish a presumption of ownership. The Gemara explains, who are they who travel to Usha, whose opinion is under discussion? It's Rabbi Yishmael. Indeed, according to Rabbi Yishmael, this would establish the presumption of ownership. This is, as we learned in the Mishnah, that Rabbi Ishmael says. In what case is this statement that 18 months are required for a non-irrigated field said? With regard to a white field, that is a grain field, but with regard to a field of trees, once he gathered his produce and then harvested his olives and then gathered his figs, these three harvests are the equivalent of 3 years. Rabbi Ishmael is of the opinion that 3 harvests are sufficient, right? 3 different crops growing in the same field. Each crop is different, and even though they are being harvested concurrently or consecutively within a year, that should be enough to establish presumptive ownership. The Gemara asks, according to the rabbis who hold that 3 years and not 3 harvests are required to establish the presumption of ownership, what is the source for the concept of this type of presumptive ownership? Right? So we understand now Yishmael's getting it from the goring. 3 distinct harvests. Doesn't need to be 3 years. So now, where are the rabbis getting their 3 years from? Rav Yosef said that it's written in a verse detailing the purchase of a field from Hanamel by Jeremiah, his cousin, during the time of the siege of Eretz Israel. This happens to be a Haftarah, um, in which I think it's the Haftarah for Bahar. Yes, because it's about reclaiming your field, right? The Jubilee year, and uh, and in the Jubilee year, the land reverts to its original owner. And so here we have Jeremiah prophesying this in chapter 32, a specific case in his own family of trying to um, reclaim the land for the family. Okay. Um, so men shall buy fields for money and subscribe the deeds and seal them. This describes the writing of a bill of sale to serve as proof of ownership of the field, since he was unable to remain living there for 3 years to establish a presumption of ownership. As the prophet Jeremiah stood in the 10th year of King Zedekiah's reign and warned people to write bills of sale for the 11th year when Eretz Israel would be overrun. Consequently, despite the fact that one purchasing a field there would be able to live on the land for 2 years, this would not be sufficient to establish a presumption of ownership, which is why he said that they should have bills of sale written. Okay, that's reading a lot into what's going on in Jeremiah chapter 32, but based on their understanding of Jeremiah's command, command to the people to write bills of sale, from their understanding of the sequence of events, that's how they're understanding 3 years. Abaye said to him, perhaps there he merely teaches us good advice, that it's advisable to have documents to preclude the need to present witnesses that can attest that one had been living on the land. This is not a proof that the presumption of ownership cannot be established in less than 3 years, right? In other words, this could be a situation that was needed at the time because an enemy was coming in and taking over the land. So you want to be sure that people have proof of which land belongs to whom. But in regular times, this would not be the case. That's what Abaye is saying. Because if you do not say so, then when he states, build houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them, from Jeremiah 29, 3 chapters before, what halachic statement was he saying? Rather, he teaches us good advice. And here, too, he teaches us good advice. Right? So in other words, you can't learn halacha from a prophet who's prophesying about religious spiritual issues and not halachic issues. He's talking about exile and what's the reason for the exile. The people sin, and if they repent, then they'll be able to build houses and dwell in them and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. So that doesn't mean anything about learning halacha from it. It's just a prophet giving a moral advice. The Gemara comments, know that this was mere advice, as it is written, and put them in an earthen vessel, that they may continue many days. This is obviously good advice to preserve the items properly, and is not a halachic statement. Therefore, this is not proof that the presumption of ownership cannot be established in under 3 years. Rather, Rava said a different reason. Okay, so we're trying now to find a reason for 3 years. A person who sees another profiting from his field might waive his rights during the first year, and he might waive his rights for 2 years, but he will not waive his rights for 3 years. Therefore, if one does not lodge a protest by the end of the 3rd year, it's tantamount to a concession that the land is not his. Right? So Rava just says, okay, this is just basic, and somehow, for some reason, an owner might let somebody else work his field. He might let him do it for 2 years in a row, but never would he let him do it for 3 years, because if he does, then he's giving up the land. That's Rava's opinion. Abaye said to him, if that's so, when it becomes clear that the land is in fact owned by another, and it's returned to its owner, it should be returned, save for the produce that the possessor consumed during the first 2 years, as the owner waived his rights to it. Why did Rav Nachman say the land is returned and the produce is returned? Rather, Rava said a different reason. So in other words, we have a law that Rav Nachman teaches that you have to return the land and also the produce from the land. And but here for the presumptive ownership, if the owner comes along, in the case that Rava is bringing up, then whatever he consumed in the first 2 years, he doesn't have to return. So rather, Rava said a different reason. A person is not particular the first year to lodge a protest, and he's not particular for 2 years, even though he does not waive his rights to the produce. He is particular to lodge a protest when he sees another profiting from his field for 3 years. Therefore, if one does not lodge a protest by the end of the third year, it's tantamount to a concession that the land is not his. Abaye said to him, if that is so, for people such as those of the Bar Eliashiv household, who are particular, even with regard to one who goes on the boundary of the field, here too will you say that presumptive ownership is established immediately as soon as one makes use of their property without their lodging a protest? So in other words, you got some families, like the Bar Eliashiv family, that is very particular and would lodge a protest right away. So if they didn't lodge the protest right away, could you say that it's a presumptive ownership right away? Why are you saying it 3 years? And if you would say that is indeed the halacha, if so, you have subjected your statement to the varying circumstances of each case, as there will be a different length of time needed to establish a presumption of ownership depending on who the prior owner is. This is untenable, right? You can't do presumptive ownership case by case. You have to have a general principle. Rather, Rava said a different reason. A person is careful with his document detailing his purchase of land for the first year after the purchase. And he's also careful for 2 and 3 years. For more time than that, he's not careful and might discard the document if no one has lodged a protest concerning his possession of the land. Therefore, the sages ruled that after 3 years have passed, he can prove his ownership by means of presumptive ownership. So in other words, the person who's working the land actually does own it, and he kept the deed for the first 2 years, but he didn't feel like he needed to keep the deed anymore. And so he doesn't need to have physical proof of a document in his hand. So that could be why Abaye said to him, if that is so, a protest that is lodged not in his presence should not be a valid protest. And if 3 years pass with no protest in his presence, presumptive ownership should be established, even if there was a protest lodged before other people. This is because the one possessing the land can say to the claimant, if you had protested in my presence, I would have been careful with my document and would not have discarded it. So the Gemara explains, so in other words, like not in the owner's presence is, like we saw in the prior discussion up above, that when it comes to land, word of mouth is okay. It doesn't have to be in the presence of the owner. Then what's the issue with keeping the deed or not? Because the owner could say, well, if you had done it in my presence, then I could have shown you the deed in the first 2 years. The Gemara explains that this claim would not be accepted because the claimant can say to him, your friend is a friend, and your friend's friend is a friend, and the assumption is that word of the protest reached you. So just as a claim could be spread of mouth, be spread by word of mouth, so too the response to the claim could have been spread by word of mouth. Okay, so let's see, it's 10:15 and we're at a red S. I'm thinking we should stop here for today, and we'll continue next time, next Sunday. I believe we do have class, and so we'll continue the discussion of presumptive ownership next time. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. Stay safe, and hope everybody stays well.
No shoveling.
Right.